Hello, I'm Colleen Jennings-Roggensack. I am the Vice President of Cultural Affairs of Arizona State University and the Executive Director of ASU Gammage. I'm also a founding board member of Creative Capital. Before we begin with our guest, Marc Bamuthi Joseph, I want to go through a few talking points for you. This series of conversations is meant to speak directly to you, applicants, fellow artists, supporters, and friends, in the hopes of shedding some light on how this ongoing crisis is affecting the art world and how we are grappling with it. To quickly summarize what Arts Relief is, we are a coalition of national arts grants makers who've come together to support artists across the U.S. during the COVID-19 crisis through both financial and informational resources. The coalition consists of the Academy of American Poets, Art Acadia, Creative Capital, Foundation for the Contemporary Arts, MAP Fund, National Young Artist Foundation, and United States Artist. To date, we have provided $5,000 grants to over 1,803 individual artists. That's over $9 million directly to artists in need. If you are an artist and want to apply, you can find our application online at artistrelief.org. It's meant to be straightforward and should only take 10 minutes. If you've applied in the past and not received a grant, you can continue to apply each month. So please apply again. This month, live conversation series and our weekly series of wellness videos, which you can find here on our YouTube page, as well as are presented with the support of Compound, a new contemporary art and wellness complex in Long Beach, California. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and here on YouTube for updates about programming, application cycles, and so much more. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Marc Bamuthi Joseph, artist, Vice President and Artistic Director of Social Impact at the John F. Kennedy Center. Hi, Marc.
Hey.
It's good to see you.
It's great to be up in here with you.
It is.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about building a BIPOC pipeline and participants in terms of the performing arts. Marc, how do we intentionally make space for BIPOC artists?
I think intentional is the word. Willful. I think that there's probably an intellectual level, there's an emotional level, and then there's an experiential level to thinking about pipeline. Intellectually, it probably isn't difficult. It's probably about math and about the willful decision to rethink aesthetics, to rethink audience, to manage our resources in a more equitable way. Emotional is a little harder because emotional alignment requires a sense of shared stakes. And in this country, we aren't taught about equity, or we don't think about frameworks of equity from the standpoint of shared stakes. We think about it in terms of a kind of Hallmark calendar way, right? So if it's March, I'm focused on women. If it's June, I'm focused on queer folk, because we are so segregated in our cultures, in schools, in the places where we live. We don't have amplified interactions with the other. So we think of the other only when the Hallmark calendar tells us so. In order to have emotional shared stakes, it's important to employ people on our staffs that that understand equity from a solidarity framework. In which case, it's also not that hard because you move according to where your heart and your biography tells you to move. But then that third layer is experiential, and this is where more than solidarity, more than shared stakes and shared risks, we have a kind of curatorial pathway, a kind of hiring pathway that's about compassion, and a compassion bred in prolonged, extended, and intentional intersection, right? So the more we are with one another, the more inclined we are to think of equitable work, to think about this pipeline less as a mathematical or intellectual chore and more just as a course of being. I happen to have been brushing my teeth like all my life, so I don't really think about it as a chore. I just kind of it's just a thing that I do. I put on my pants, I put on socks. It's just a thing that I do. But you have to be in the experience. This labor has to be a part of your everyday. You have to do it long enough. You have to commit to it long enough that it just becomes a part of your job. It doesn't have to be stated as part of your job description. The place where I think many of us are right now is the intellectual layer. Yes. We know that some like a mathematical application of these ideas is necessary. But in order to truly do this work, we have to hire so that it's part of our emotional understanding of how we do this work. And we have to be committed. So it's part of our experiential understanding of how we do this work.
You know, Marc, I couldn't agree with you more. I think also at this time, we are now layered with two pandemics.
Yes.
We're layered with the pandemic of COVID-19, and we're layered with the pandemic of racism. Yes. We know with COVID-19, there's going to be a vaccine someday. With racism, the vaccine is all of us. And it's a much hotter petri dish. So I think when you speak about, you know what to do, there are people who don't brush their teeth every day.
Yeah, right.
And then expect to have great teeth.
Yeah. Right.
I don't brush them every day.
Yeah.
But I think that is one of those things in both practice and in dialogue that if we, Jawa Jawaharlal said, you cannot expect to become a dancer by taking one class.
Right.
Just doesn't happen. So part of this dialogue and this discussion has to happen all of the time. So it does become second nature, just as you have said. One of the things we often hear about the pipeline is, well, where are they? Where are these Black, Indigenous, people of color who are artists? I don't know where they are. How do I find them? And whereas our lives are such that we are enriched and surrounded. And so part of that is the exposure. And I think about the pandemic at this time as a way, actually, the good part of it is there's a way for great exposure because organizations, whether it's the Kennedy Center or ASU Gammage or any of the theaters across the country, are now trying to keep their communities culturally enriched through digital platforms. And so the opportunity to see a lot of artists in a lot of different settings is digitally. And so it's one of the things when I think about where are they, we need to connect those digital platforms. We need to connect that. But you said another important thing. Here you are, the vice president at the Kennedy Center.
Yeah.
No, I don't have to worry about the Kennedy Center. Though Alicia's always been there, so I didn't really have to worry about that part either. But that's all right. But here we are, African Americans, in these pivotal positions.
Yes.
So it is a juxtaposing of not only BIPOC artists, but BIPOC administrators.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, we saw President Obama eulogize the great John Lewis earlier today, and in his grace, and let's face it, in his swagger, let alone his intelligence and his comportment, we were very clear what a leader looks like. Someone with a unifying vision centered in compassion and desiring of joy. We have to ask ourselves what the nature of this country is. Who are we inclined to be?
Yes. Yes.
And how do those inclinations, how does that inclination then announce itself in who we choose to lead us? We are not choosing our leaders in the arts. I would hope that as we choose our leaders in the arts, that we would be so prescient to think about cultural vision and cultural leadership as a prerequisite for the gig. You know, when people say, when you say things like, well, where are the artists? It's like, you know, I would love to just walk down the street and say, where are the white people? I don't see any white artists. But I would sound friggin' ridiculous if I said some shit like that. So I wouldn't.
Right.
You're not actually asking where are the artists. What you're saying is, I do not believe in the excellence, or I don't understand the belief system that where the aesthetics of these artists are prominently held and understood. You're not saying I can't find the artists, because I'm here, dog. I'm like right in front of you. What you're saying is, you know, you talk about you don't see color. No, actually, you don't see my community.
Right.
And so we have to choose leaders, you know, not just according to demographic specificity, but we have to choose leaders with a kind of cultural clairvoyance. Not prognosticators, but people who see clearly.
Yes.
I want you to see color, which is something that I think has been said often enough. But to the boards of directors and to funders and foundations, I think we're beginning to ask ourselves questions about the alignment of cultural leadership in administrative positions with a clear articulation of a cultural ambition.
Right.
These are the things that may have been lacking in our field, or certainly have been disproportionate in our field, which we have to work to rectify. Colleen, you've been at this for a minute. Can you talk a little bit about your arc, and maybe specifically how you would have entered this field differently if you were entering now, as opposed to when you first started?
And that is such a great question, Marc, because I was thinking when you were saying everyone knows where the artists are, they don't. And I think as when I began over 40 years ago, stopped dancing, started presenting, I had to go to certain things. You went to regional booking conferences like the Western Alliance of Arts Administrators. You went to the National Conference of the Association of Performing Arts Presenters. You went to the Pillow to see artists perform. You went to Newport Jazz. You went, so there were just places you went. What didn't exist when I was there, and I want to tell people today, if I was jumping in, I would be looking at organizations like Creative Capital and the amazing artists that come out of there, and the fantastic work that Creative Capital has done in the spectrum of artists, in contemporary artists, in the great diversity of artists, in the various kinds of art forms. So I think sometimes people don't know where to look. I think sometimes people go, I wonder where I find them. I always think about the Creative Capital Retreat, which you've been at, where where 150 artists get to present 15 minutes of their work.
Yes.
You know, I do a lot of shopping there.
Yes.
I do a lot of, I'm going to be there. Look
Mm-hmm.
at that. I've never seen that artist before, or this is
Mm-hmm.
great. So I think that one of the things that we need to think about is where those places are that a brand new presenter coming into the field may not know, may not be able to find them. So I think that is important. I also think this notion of where the financial resources go. And so we have had, and this is an ongoing discussion in the field,
Mm-hmm.
but that monies are out there, and often monies do not get placed in the hands of artists,
Yes.
performing artists in particular. They
Yes.
get placed in the hands of presenters like ourselves. You happen to be wearing two hats today. You're actually wearing 4 or 5 hats, but
Probably.
the 2 hats are presenting an artist.
Yeah.
And that's an issue in terms of our philanthropic organizations, in terms of our businesses supporting and underwriting us, that we also need to take a look at. And I'm going to throw one more thing in there before you respond, is the whole notion of the creative producer.
Yes.
The producer who has been working hand to mouth with an artist to get their work up and going.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some, Beth Morrison is one of those folks,
Yes.
Tommy Friedman is one of those folks,
Mm-hmm.
and Bloomberg is one of those, and Berg is one of those folks. And so there are a whole series of those artists who are doing that. So we've got the presenter, we've got the producer, we've got the artist, and we've got these funding sources that tend to just feed the pipeline one way.
Yeah. Yeah. The pipeline is also an epistemological pipeline.
Yes.
It's a pipeline rooted in these knowledge sources and what our friend Liz Lerman refers to as the canon, and how it is that we found ourselves in the space where we had to be connected to art. Whether or not we self-identify as interventionists, as we curate, as we administer, as we perform, or whether we choose to take a more, let's call it a more of a hands-off approach in terms of the art that we seek. And for a lot of us, there's kind of a careful, I always refer to myself as more as a pedagogue and educator than as a curator. And because I'm a working artist, I love to collaborate. I think another aspect of the pipeline is what epistemologies, what knowledge bases, what capacity do you have to catalyze and provoke that then inform who you're willing to collaborate with?
Right.
Right. Because a lot of these traditions, when we talk about artists outside of historical center, a lot of these traditions rely on a kind of energetic reciprocity. There are many of us that really just want to do our art and just be left alone. You know what I mean? Like you be over there, I'm gonna do my thing over here. But many of us, I think, crave a kind of dialogue with presenters and with producers, as you said that you named so many of them, and that dialogue only is possible if the presenter or the producer has a certain literacy, has a certain epistemology. But once you have that literacy, once you share cultural language, now you're more able to present the artist in a context that makes greater sense. So it's like, the pipeline goes underneath the stage, let's say. The pipeline goes underneath the field, but you also have to build a parallel track that is very clear and very transparent. And this, again, speaks to who we're hiring to lead these organizations. Are you a multi-literate leader? Are you a multi-literate arts leader? Because if you only know one thing, this might not be the gig for you. Like, the dude that's in the White House right now, this is probably not the right gig for him. And I would never, ever, ever associate someone in the performing arts with the current occupant of the White House. But it is just to give a stark example of some of us are not all built for this moment in time.
Right.
And if we're not built for it, then we need to develop the skills and the epistemologies that put us in present compliance, present ethical compliance with what the world needs now out of the cultural sector.
And I think along those lines, what I believe is so critical is unless an artist is at the table when you are having a discussion, you're not having a full discussion. And I
Yeah.
will give you a case in point. One of the things with Black Lives Matter and even with COVID, there's a rush to find, I need to have a Black artist.
Yeah.
I need to, instead of saying, we need to address issues both externally and internally to our organization, but to our community, and who helps us best to address those. And
Yeah.
I'll give you
That's
a
great.
case in point. We're working with our chief of police and Daniel Bernard Romaine, who not only was a creative capital artist, but also served on the board as well, and Michael Rode with Sojourner Theater, and myself are working with our chief to look at how we retrain a police force. Retrain. And we have Chief Michael Thompson is kind of amazing, but he is like, help me figure out how to do this. So after several meetings, we looked at each other and said, well, wait a second. How are they being trained? What are they being taught? And what about the skills that an artist brings to the table about how you listen,
Yes.
how you know when to back up,
Word.
how you know when to stand still, how you know when to push forward. And so that's just one of the small things that an artist can help us do in this time period. And I think for presenters who are helping their communities grapple with these issues, looking at artists not as, oh, you're going to perform on the stage, or since we're talking digitally, you're going to perform digitally, but rather, can you help me think through this?
Yeah.
I have three questions when I work with an artist. What do you want? What do I want? And what do we want together?
Yeah.
And through that, you've heard them before. And through that, we figure out how to move forward together.
Yes.
So thoughts about artists in the roles of community.
Oh, you know, I grew up in such a way and am currently in such a place where I cannot separate the art that I make from the place where I live. Not just the physical place, whether it's the Bay Area of Washington, D.C., but the psychic place that I live. And my psychic location is, I am a first generation American, born of Haitian parents. I talk about how both my ancestors and the slave catchers are running behind me. And I am running. You know, we just did this this short video for the Kennedy Center where we talked about our social impact initiatives, and I described myself as being of the privileged and also of the hunted. That dual perch, that dual responsibility, forces me to think about the art that I make within the context of the urgency of the times. And this is what I meant earlier when I said the emotional stakes, equity within a solidarity framework. The broader truth is that artists, and I, you know, one of my very best friends is an emerging mental health professional. And we had this conversation not too long ago about racism as a pathology. I was trying to argue, let's say that the police that killed George Floyd, that was a sick individual, that was a pathological action, that he was pathological. And she argued correctly that racism is not a pathology, because racism can be taught. Pathologists, someone who's pathological, you just can't pass that along. So what that says to me is that it's not the individual that's sick, it's the society that's sick. What that says to me is that I would work with a mental health professional to heal. A mental health professional would diagnose me, the individual, and we would work together to heal. the way that a mental health professional diagnoses an individual, an artist diagnoses society. An artist is the one that looks at the landscape of the culture and through language or musical notes or movement reflects back to the culture exactly what is wrong and also what the possibility is, and then is also a conduit for healing, because typically what the artist does is creates a portrait of what is possible. Here's where we are, here's maybe where we might be, here's where we are, here's where we could be. And I don't think that that function lies with the police. I don't think that it lies with the governor. I don't even think that it necessarily lies with educators, although I respect the educational profession probably more than any other. It lies with artists. So a sick society further makes itself ill by not treating its artists well. John F. Kennedy said, a nation is not great if it is not graceful. Who teaches us grace? Who exemplifies grace? Who teaches us to be better? I have to think that I've grown more from listening to Marvin Gaye or reading Toni Morrison or performing with Daniel Bernard Romain than I have by like watching C-SPAN.
Right.
So, so
Right.
that.
So as you know, as we are thinking of this time, and everyone is housebound in some direction around this country. How does an artist use that creative energy and that creative talent inside these little boxes that we are talking about? And then how does a presenter work with that to help translate that back into a community who is in desperate need of that?
Yeah, it's a trip, man, because, you know, the pandemic is a madly democratizing force. It is the great reset. Here we are.
Right.
But the pandemic has, while it is a democratizing force, it also has surfaced the great holes in our democracy. And, you know, I think about, you know, there are 4 kids in the household, and there's 1 computer maybe in the household. Who gets to go to school,
Right.
and when?
Right.
How many of us, you know, you and I just happen to be showing the backgrounds of our crib, you know, the 2 of us and Kelly, shout out Kelly, you know, we're all showing the backgrounds of our crib. Who doesn't want to do that? Like, how many of us don't want to do that? Right. So, so there are all these ways that the digital divide is further surfaced. You know, is further
separating.
Is further surfaced. That division is more clearly there. So, you know, for cultural producers, you know, one thing that we have to do, and you know, we have a program at the Kennedy Center called Couch Concerts. We've been streaming daily. Now, you know, we're doing a different show from a different state in the country from now to excuse me, from now to the end of the year. We have a program called Arts Across America. We're streaming from people's living rooms or sanctuaries every day. But now we have to ask ourselves, I think, a deeper question, which is how we're able to divert resources so that our cultural mandate isn't just to like beam art onto the screens of other artists. It's to think about the value of artists outside of what it is that they make on stage or screen. Our mandate is to ask ourselves about culture writ large, not just shows in a box.
Right. And I think, especially for all of our artists who are listening, the thought of, you know, how do you make those connections? We have a large digital platform. where we support local artists, where we support national artists and international artists, and we pay them.
Amen.
So that is a big discussion for the presenting community as our stages and our communities are sitting dark, and artists are sitting making work, trying to make work, but not being paid for it. Like, I don't believe in free.
Yeah, me neither.
I don't believe in free. So I think that it's incumbent upon both of us as president, vice presidents, as presenters, to say, we are going to lead the way and make sure our fellow colleagues say, this isn't free. So that has to become an understanding in supporting each other. I mean, everyone hopes that tomorrow the vaccine comes for COVID and we're kind of back in business. But if it doesn't, we have to figure out another way how to do that. And we also have to figure out, and this is a very detailed technical thing, of how our contracts are.
Yeah.
And one of the very tough moments that happened when COVID hit, there were presenters who said, well, I'm declaring force majeure and I'm not paying you. Whereas we said, well, we can't declare force majeure, because force majeure actually literally means you've burned down the house. So if the house hasn't burnt down, then things have to keep going on. But we're going to come back to a new world that's going to say force majeure, pandemic, blah, 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 blah. It's going to be even harder. And so I think there have to be deeper conversations with artists and presenters as we navigate and negotiate our relationship. And how we each have a responsibility to each other. I am by no means condemning any of my presenting colleagues, because we're all trying to keep a house running that costs money every single day, whether anyone's in it or not. But how do we together figure out how to do that so everybody gets something, so everybody can have a little something to push forward with?
It's true. I mean, we all have to rethink the values proposition. As a, working at the Kennedy Center is the largest institution I've ever worked ever worked out. I started in nonprofit work with Youth Speaks. My colleague James Cass and I, as we founded this youth poetry organization, literally the organization was based in a spare room at his crib and in the trunk of my car for the most part in the late 90s. So, and as an artist, I know what it is just to not be paid, just to have to do with nothing. So now I go to this behemoth of an organization which did not act gracefully or responsibly. I think when the pandemic first hit, I think that there was a lot of fear, as with all of us, and just the stakes. The great poet Christopher Wallace said, "Mo money, mo problems," and that shit is real. That's real. And so we can just kind of get into the scale of that. I think that we learn from our initial mistakes. And I think that we're doing a lot better now in terms of our integrity and a kind of compliance. But a lot of that has to do with what we consider the value of the art is itself, and what we consider the institutional mandate to be itself. And this is where the concurrent crises really made a difference, I think, in the institutional psychology, because the crisis of white supremacy is 400 years old at a minimum in this country, although many of us are awakening to that phenomena as a crisis, right? The great James Baldwin is one of those literary prophets that gave us the language to understand what we were experiencing as an urgent thing, not as kind of like a passively, like racism, not as concept, but as an urgent thing. But the murders, first the live execution of Ahmaud Arbery, and then the weaponized whiteness of Amy Cooper in Central Park with Charles Cooper, then the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, what these events meant in terms of the public consciousness and in terms of cultural producers. What it spurred was a revisitation of the urgency of white supremacy itself, its impact, and exactly what the responsibility of presenters are. It also created enough political capital for all of us where we could go to our funders, we could go to our boards, we could go to our executive team and re-examine the composition of all the above. And so we're not just thinking about the value of an artist on stage. We're thinking about the value of artistic intellect on the broader cultural landscape. And there's a difference. As a dancer, the value of my body diminishes over time, which means that the value of my art diminishes over time. All my value just can't live in my body. Someone can take a photograph and that value accrues over time. For those of us that are in the performing arts, how do we build equity literally in the art that we make if that equity erodes over time? And I think this is the kind of vocabulary that is now being introduced to cultural arts centers, to cultural centers, through the filter of the abolition of white supremacy. That's a huge mandate, but it also means the repositioning of resources to communities and to individuals that historically haven't had them.
Exactly. And I also think that there's a time now with what's happening with COVID-19 that there will be people who don't return to their previous positions, which means there will be vacancies. There will be the ability to say, I don't know, I can't feed the pipeline. Well, yes, you can. And now we're able to do it. And I think to keep that in mind, that opportunities are coming out of this. And there's opportunities just as yourself to say, I would like to have an artist be the vice president of artistic and social impact for my center. I would be, many people now are saying, the new thing is saying, I'm going to get an EDI specialist. I'm going to get an EDI specialist. So like going, well, why don't you get an artist? And that artist can help you think through. Why don't you get a BIPOC artist who will help you think through those things? So it is a time for us to open up our minds and think differently and think about the role of the artist differently. I do not by any means not want artists to create work. I think that's so vitally important. But I am sitting in front of a amazing, I don't even know how you do it, artist who creates work, but also provides platforms for other artists to create.
Yeah, I think it's also in our nature because we've had to do with not much resource at all. There is no artist that, let me say, there are very few artists, particularly Black, Indigenous, people of color. There are very few of us that just started with $1 zillion and just, like came out of our Maybach and just, just started like doing pliés. Like that's not really how this works. That's not really how this, how we get down. So we have to make with less. And, let's face it, the arts sector is increasingly under-resourced. There's limited opportunity, and the scale of what we're supposed to make in order to be recognized and, I'll use the word ascend to a place like the Gammage or ascend to a place like the Kennedy Center, that requires considerable resource, and that's incredibly hard to come by. But then so because that has been our condition, because we've operated from a unique kind of scarcity, but had to make work with others nonetheless, I think we're uniquely qualified to do more with less within the context of institution or organization. So it's the word that I would like to use is deployment.
employment.
right? If in the harshest of times, in wartime, a leader would say to, let's say in this time, a leader would say to General Motors, I don't need you to make cars. I need you to make ventilators. You have all the parts right there
Yes.
to switch up the application of how you use the infrastructure. Well, how do we deploy our artists in this moment of crisis? We have to deploy artists to design experiences that
Absolutely.
that pertain to the psychological health of the body politic. We have to
Right.
deploy artists to think about our organizations, think about our relationships to community just a little bit differently. One of the things that we've done prior to the pandemic is we've deployed artists to be conduits to community in fits and starts.
Yes.
On a project-based level. And this is the key, Colleen. We'll say, I'll commission you to do this community-based project for 3 months, and then you bounce.
Right.
You know, I say in our statement at the Kennedy Center, and I believe that if racism is structural, then anti-racism also must be structural. If we think racism is systemic, then anti-racist action also must be systemic, which means don't deploy an artist for 3 months to make an acute connection to community. Hire an artist
Right.
and deploy that artist to develop systems over
Exactly.
time to
Exactly.
transform both the organization and the surrounding
Exactly.
community landscape.
I believe that the commitment has to be about depth and breadth. So
Right.
we've been working with Lemon Anderson, and he is with us for 3 years. Now,
Work.
he didn't stop doing his TV work, his television, he didn't stop doing his stage work,
Yeah.
everything else. But in that 3-year time, he said, yeah, these are the things I like to do. And he said, great. Let us do that and build that infrastructure. So it is about that length. I would also ask you, in terms of, and since we are both involved in the performing arts world, that's exactly what we should be talking about. But I have this ongoing thought. I'm going to throw it out there into the ether.
Let's do it.
And we'll begin to look at some questions. But I believe this is an incredible time to hire visual artists. Like the whole discussion about this statue and that statue. I believe in hiring communication statues. So when I think about Candy Wiley's work, The Rumor of War, that's the most stunning work next to Karen Walker's piece that was at the Tate Modern that I have seen ever. And talk about breaking through race and breaking through what we believe traditions are and breaking through what we believe we worship and we don't worship. Both those artists have done tremendous things. There are many other amazing artists out there. And we want to build monuments to things. Let's ask artists to build monuments that engage us in how to make this country have a conversation with itself.
Yes.
And so we traditionally do not work with visual artists, but I'm a big believer of pushing that idea out there. That this is the time to start hiring those visual artists, having them make this work big pieces that communities begin to say, oh, I didn't think about that before. Oh, that makes sense to me. So I think that there are those opportunities. Marc, if you can see your questions in your chat room, mine happens to not be showing very well. So you can pick out some of those questions because we have about 15 minutes.
All right,
and
cool.
we have other questions for ourselves as well, but let's hear what people are thinking.
I see one question, which lucky for me, you get to answer first. The question is, how can we as artists who are not BIPOC, who are not Black, Indigenous, people of color, also be supportive and collaborative if we are struggling too? How can artists who are not Black, Indigenous, people of color also be supportive and collaborative if we're struggling too?
Well, and I have to say, there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunities. And first of all, Marc Bamuthi Joseph and Colleen Jennings-Roggensack, being Black people, are not going to solve the problem of racism. As much as we like to think by ourselves, we
Uh-huh.
solve it. We need
That's real.
allies.
Yeah.
And so the notion of hiring allies, who I spoke about earlier, Michael Road with Sojourn Theater. Michael is a white man who's helping who's helping Daniel, a Black man, and myself with this issue because of the skill sets he brings to the table. So we are not in this alone, and we by no means to segregate our artistic community. We are in this together. So absolutely, positively. And I think that there are opportunities that we're looking at now that do several things. One, artists who work in the digital platform well. Taylor Mack and I were talking like a few weeks ago about various things, and he said, that's not how I want to work. That's not my thing. That's not how I relate to people. So there are going to be artists who work in that platform well, who we need to make connection with and know. The other thing is, I do believe, and I know I am not the only one, I believe in art for art's sake. I do not believe necessarily every message or issue we're working on the day needs to solve itself in an art form. One of my most amazing artists that I love so much is Echo, of Echo and Coma. And the work that she has done, and we've worked together all the years, I feel there's so much you read into it, and it's so important. But she doesn't come out and say, I'm doing this work because Japanese lives matter, or Japanese Americans' lives matter. She's doing this work. So there is still room in this world that we are in for artists who are making art out of their own thoughts and their own imaginations. So I believe every presenter who is carefully curating thinks about the breadth of that work. Not every single artwork, every single residency is going to deal with it. Much of it, our mission is connecting communities. So no matter what you do, including ACO, who came to work with us, I find a way, my job, working with you, to connect into those communities. So yes, there's a place, and thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, it's a deep question, and the image that I have in my mind is of two people drowning. And how does the drowning person be supportive and collaborative of another person who's drowning?
Right.
And maybe maybe one person is drowning because there's an incredible tide. They're caught in a wave. Just the force of the ocean. And then the other person is drowning because of all that, and because they have a weight attached to their ankle.
Right.
I don't know if, as you're struggling, you're necessarily in a position to be saving someone who is also struggling. And so the onus, I don't think, is on somebody who is not in a moment of maximum agency to sacrifice themselves. I don't think that that's what we're talking about. But what it does do is it points to just kind of a larger question about power in general, and agency in general, and how it is that we think about the construction of this landscape. And so where I do think that artists have agency is in the design of who it is that we are going to be next, who it is that we're going to collectively be next. Imagine, as we are struggling together, imagine ourselves on the shore. We've all had them hard nights, Colleen.
We have all had them.
But worse, we've all had those really hard mornings where you were like, oh man, whatever it is that I did last night, fool, I'm never gonna do that again. I'm gonna be better, Lord. I'm gonna be, you make all those promises. You talk about what you're going to do when. I know I've said, man, I am never gonna miss a live show again. When all this goes down, I'm gonna see the Roots every day. I'm just gonna follow. I'm gonna follow all my artists around. I'm gonna hug everybody.
Every single one.
I'm gonna hug everybody at the show. Watch, I'm gonna do it all. Like, but what I would say is remember,
Yes.
because there will be a time when we're on solid land.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now is the time to remember. I'm going to use maybe a provocative term. There is a particular guilt economy right now. The market is flooded with resources right now,
Right.
based on a lack of action and understanding in our shared past. My worry is, as we are on solid ground, that will dissipate, that economy will dry up.
It will. It will.
So let's remember, when we're on solid ground, let's remember this moment. Let's design for a future that is reflective of the integrity that we held right now in this moment.
Right. Sherilyn Eiffel said at the Black Theater United speech, Audra McDonald was interviewing, and she said, this is a window, and the window's going to close.
Yes.
So we got to take as great of advantage of this window as possible. But to our person who put the question forward, it isn't an only us window.
Yes.
It's not just me and Marc. It is a collective window, and how we either try to keep that window open another window where we're all advantaged there. Let's take another question. We have about 7 minutes.
Great. So a comment. The comment is, I think artists must also sit firmly and confidently in our power to reiterate compensation for our work. We have to empower each other to engage in compensatory, beneficial, and valued experiences, which is an amazing comment. A second comment, there's an APAP working group working on the contract issue and more equitable industry practices now.
Great.
So shout out to everyone that is making comments about contracts as moral documents. I talk about that a lot, budgets as moral documents. There is a question here. How aware are funders of the fact that artists should be deployed to develop systems instead of instrumentalized to do projects?
I think this is also a window opening for funders. And what I'm hearing from the larger funders and even the smaller funders, and I get calls all the time going, tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what we should be doing. And everyone sort of put the brakes on. Some of the really amazing foundations said, here's some money for artists. And Creative Capital was part of that gathering. Others have said, here's money for presenters, like keep your doors open. What are you going to do? And the others are just kind of sitting there thinking and saying, how do we move forward in a way that's not a Band-Aid, in a way that creates a system, in a way that supports BIPOC artists, in a way that adds to the cultural landscape. So now is the time. And I would say to whomever wrote that question, what ideas and concepts you have, people have open ears to hear them. Local, regional, national conversations are happening, and to send Marc and I both notes saying, this is where I think funding should be going, what direction. And the NEA is another one. I was a presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts. Everyone is rethinking how things are being done. And this is the time to have artists come forth and tell us. So we have it in our ears, in our heads, and as we move forward, it is critical. Absolutely critical. That's a really good question.
It's a great question, and one of the things that the question just speaks to is vocabulary. And why it is that we have to put these phrases, budgets as moral documents, contracts as moral documents. This is why we have to propagate language, because we are a kind of, as broad as our radius is, we're a small circle.
We are. It is a small universe that we travel in. It is a very small universe. I would also add, because I wear another hat as well, I wear a commercial hat and sit on the Broadway Board of Governors. And now is also a time that we've put forth statements. They include hiring practices, changing and hiring things are done, changing and whose voices are at the table. I was hosting a celebration of Camille Brown having won the Obie, and just talking about, I started working with Camille when she was a young dancer. started
Mm-hmm.
her own contemporary dance company,
Mm.
and is going to direct a show on Broadway next year.
Word up.
And so all of you performing artists out there, there's a hunger for the new. There's a
Mm-hmm.
hunger for different stories. There's a hunger for different talent. So
Mm.
there's some other doors that are open that are not necessarily our traditional pathways. But I want to say a few things. We've got about 3 minutes left, but I just want to say, as sort of walking away with something,
Yes.
if there are places where you have thought, this is where I would like to perform, this is something I have to contribute to, this is someone I want to have a conversation with, now's the time.
Yeah.
Now's the time to write. And you can tell all of them. Colleen Jennings-Roggensack and Marc Bamuthi Joseph
Yes.
told me to get in
Yes.
contact with you to see if we
Yes.
could talk about my work, to see
Yeah.
if there's something we can work on together digitally. Is there something long range we can work on?
Yeah.
Now is the time, because people, we're doing all of these, but
Mm-hmm.
we're also sitting with our theaters, not running. So
Yeah.
I find this to be a most important time for conversation and connection.
Absolutely.
It is still about having someone open a door for you, standing on someone's shoulders. So use mine and use Marc's.
Word up. Word up.
Okay.
It is true. It's everything, every meeting is a design lab at this point. Every opportunity is the rehearsal room at this point. There's I know most of us, through both a call to the expertise that we've developed and also out of a sense of nostalgia, we all want to go back. But ultimately, we are building this thing right now and we're moving forward.
Right.
And there's a lot of, if the proscenium is the beating heart of your organization right now, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
So then what is the stuff that can be transposed or extrapolated from a proscenium experience? How does your personal mandate as an artist, how does that work now within the context of where our culture is, where our culture wants to be? And I think the smart producers, the humble presenters, the gifted artists, the savvy and strategic culture makers are poking holes in everything because the shit is already full of holes.
Right.
So
right,
you might as well
right.
just keep going. And ultimately, what we want to do is build a vessel that can support all of us in a more healthy way, that centers art and culture producers and cultural makers in a different kind of way as harbingers for the equitable, inspired, and inclusive world that we all want.
Yes. And I'm going to read something to you.
Please.
Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal and a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and fight for it.
Amen.
Arunda Hadi Roy, and
Ashe.
fight for it. So it is the time. This is the time now. I will tell you that this has been most amazing. This has been wonderful. I want to spend just a moment or two praising Susie Duvalier at Creative Capital.
Right on.
I want to also say, Ashley,
Word up.
you got us where we are.
Amen.
I know on this filming here, we also had Isaac and Alex, and Mariana was a part of this. I want to thank you, Marc Bamuthi Joseph. I want to say to every artist, every presenter out there, we are in a very delicate, tight ecosystem, and together we will get through this.
Yes, we will. Ashe.
Ashe.
All right. You be safe out there, okay?
I will.
All right. I'll see you on the path.
Thank you. Take care.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye.